Hello and welcome back to the Explaining Brazil podcast. My name is Gustavo Ribeiro, editor-in-chief of the Brazilian Report. And as part of our joint effort with the Brazil Office Alliance to cover Brazil's 2026 election, I'm pleased to welcome back James Green, a historian at Brown University and president of the board of directors of the Washington Brazil office. James, I'm always happy to see you and talk to you. How are you doing?
I'm great. It's a wonderful day, cold day in São Paulo, and kind of enjoying the cold weather a little bit.
Well, I'm in Brasilia, so we don't know the concept of winter in Brasilia. It's almost 30 degrees with bright sunshine. So, so let's delve already into the election because we have, as always, tons of stuff to talk about. And it's funny because there was one saying that Tancredo Neves, a former bigwig in Brazilian politics who died in the 80s just before taking office as president, he used to say that politics is just like looking at the clouds. You look once and it's one way, and then you look back a few minutes later and it's completely different. And yes, the vicissitudes of Brazilian politics are very hard to understand. Just a few months ago, the polls showed Flávio Bolsonaro ahead of President Lula, and it seemed as he was a force that nobody could stop, and that Lula was heading towards a political beating as he never suffered. A few months later, the polls seem to show Lula's lead getting more and more consolidated. And now we see the Flávio Bolsonaro campaign battling multiple crises at once. We have infighting within the family, within the Liberal Party, the PL. We see other parties hesitating to jump on the Flávio Bolsonaro bandwagon. And we see polls that are very much not favorable to him. So how do you reckon this moment for Flávio Bolsonaro? And I remind you that we are 10 days away. We're recording this on July the 13th. So in 12 days, he will be anointed as the Liberal Party's presidential candidate. So in what mood will we see this sort of coronation?
We're in the midst of an implosion in the Liberal Party, the crisis of the campaign, the rivalry between his stepmother, Michele Bolsonaro, and her stepson. There's a real tension between the two. Her announcement 2 weeks ago now, saying that she really felt not paid attention to, stilted by her stepson, and felt offended, had not been consulted, and basically was breaking with the party. She had built this very successful campaign within the Liberal Party, the Partido Liberal, to win over mostly evangelical Christian women, but women in general, conservative women, who have a national organization that has been disbanded, but she set up her own new organization. She's not going away. It's not clear whether she's going to run for the Senate in Brasilia at this point. I'm curious to hear what you say about that, but it's really caused a serious division. And I have a very unscientific way of figuring out what happens in Brazilian politics. It's called data Uber. It's when I talk to Uber drivers. They predicted in 2001, when no one believed it, that Lula was going to win in 2002. At the time, it was taxi cab drivers, which they tend to be as conservative in São Paulo as the Uber drivers. But now I'm finding several of the Uber drivers who said, well, I voted for Bolsonaro, Jair in the past, but I'm not sure I'm going to vote for his son, Flávio. I think I'm going to sit out this election, which is a very surprising thing, because if there is, in fact, an erosion of the base of his support within in the far right and the right wing, he could really drop in the polls, and it's even theoretically possible, although I think it's relatively remote, that Lula could win in the first round of the elections.
Right, and I think that this speaks to the limits of an understudy. And we saw that time and again. In 2018, Lula was in prison, and Fernando Haddad, his next in line, ran with the slogan, Lula is Haddad, Haddad is Lula. But this transfer of political capital only goes so far. I mean, it is if Lula or Jair Bolsonaro points at me and say, Gustavo Ribeiro is my presidential candidate, I'm sure to get 35 to 40%, but not having the charisma and the name recognition of the true owner of that political capital, whether it's Lula to the left or Bolsonaro to the far right, there's a limit to that. And that's something that we at the Brazilian Report and you guys at the Brazil office have pointed out throughout this past few months in our coverage, that it's not automatic. It's not just because he has the Bolsonaro name that the votes are going towards him. And now that Michelle Bolsonaro has exposed him, saying, and she used very harsh words, saying that he humiliated her, and that hurts Flávio in the demographics that were already his soft spots, women and evangelical votes. Because unlike his father, he's not seen as this guardian of Christian values. And women have always been elusive for the Bolsonaros. Women represent about 53% of the Brazilian electorate. And we wrote this at the Brazilian Report a few months ago. They tend to lean towards the left, not necessarily because they are left-leaning, but because they identify with many of the policies that the left champions, such as social policies, policies to keep children in school, anti-gun policies, because Brazil is a country where single-parent households are enormous, especially in vulnerable areas, and mothers who see their children being co-opted by criminal organizations and being killed by this turf wars that we have between different factions. They are usually against that tough on crime, let's kill them all policies that many to the right are championing.
You know, in addition to that, his brother, Eduardo Bolsonaro, who's in the United States lobbying for the far right in Brazil, has an ally, Paulo Figueiredo, journalist, the grandson of the last of the 5 general dictators in Brazil, who made a recent statement about that you can't trust women how they vote. They have to vote what their husbands tell them to do. And if they don't follow their husbands, then they'll vote wrongly. That really backfired again. Again, not against the most loyal supporters, the ideologically convinced, but among other soft supporters or people who are not happy with Lula or want to vote against Lula. And again, there could be a large amount of absenteeism, a large amount of people just voting blank. There's a tiny little fine to do that, even though voting is obligatory for people up to a certain age. That could really hurt his chances as well. Plus,
you can not show up to the polls and just justify with an app from the electoral justice, so you don't even have to pay that symbolic fine.
Right, and so in addition to that, I mean, the scandal of the Masters Bank, which has not been at all explained, the promises to provide information, which was never provided. A notion, the far right used the issue of corruption against the Workers' Party and against Lula over the years. And now, even though there has been a small scandal within the Senator Jacques Wagner from Bahia, who is a very important person in the Workers' Party, he's removed from his position as the leader of the Workers' Party within the Senate to kind of neutralize this accusation of some kind of possible money laundering or a scandal involved with his personal finances. But there's so much more that is being pinned on the far right. And that really undercuts, again, another upper hand that they had about saying we're the people who are against corruption and the left and Lula is corrupt. So these are things that are really weakening his campaign. On the other hand, it's important to understand that the economy will be important, and there's been a slight growth in inflation. And given the Trump's policies in the Middle East and his insistence on fighting against Iran, closing the Gulf of Hormuz between the two competing powers, there is a possibility of gas prices going up some more, which could cut into the Brazilian economy and affect, to a certain extent, people's pocketbooks and therefore their possible electoral decisions. But I think this point, the far right is in serious trouble. And the point that you made about we only have 10 days before the candidates are set in stone is that alternative candidates cannot easily surge. Michele Bolsonaro, who some people think might be able to kind of slip in and become the alternative candidate, that's just not going to happen. And the other center-right or right-wing candidates are trying to poll well are really doing poorly, and I think have no possibility of gaining traction to become an alternative. So I think we're seeing a declining support of Flávio Bolsonaro, and this is helping Lula. I don't think we can say that the outcome is guaranteed, because so many things can happen in the next 4 months, as we know in Brazil. But I think these are the trends.
No, and it's funny because with polarization being so present and politics being so calcified, we are in a state, and I think it's reminiscent from the U.S., which is a state where nothing matters because people are already so attached to one camp or the other, but everything matters because the margins are so slim that one small thing could tilt the balance one way or the other, right?
And there's a group in the middle, the kind of the independent voters, similar to the United States, which is a large number of people, who could very much be influenced by last minute questions. And there's another dynamic. I think it's true. I don't know if it's true in other countries, but I've observed it in Brazil that people like to win, to bet on the winner. And so when there's a sense that Lula's winning, if he's winning in the polls and it's showing that he's really having an edge of 6 to 10 points, then many people will say, well, I'm gonna support Lula. Let's give him 4 more years, give him a try. And so that's another advantage for someone who's doing well in the polls. And if you recall, in 2022, even though the margin was extremely slim at the end, 1.6 points between the two candidates, the polls throughout the campaign showed that Lula was going to win, which was one of the reasons why it was very hard for Bolsonaro and his group to really pull off the idea of a coup, because it was seen that it was really against the inevitable winner of the elections.
But it's funny because the polls, they have, especially in the first round, they have been slightly off this past few electoral cycles, especially underestimating a little bit Bolsonaro's performance, and that has been a major grievance within the far right. But what I always try to say whenever we are reporting on the polls at the Brazilian Report is that the polls are important not because of their predictive value, especially because I think today, like you said, last-minute decisions are more and more present, and voters, because of the way that we consume information, are more and more volatile. I think they're important because of how they affect political brokers, whether we're talking about how candidates rethink their strategies, how parties rethink their alignments. And I think we're seeing that playing out before our eyes. For instance, a few months ago, Flávio Bolsonaro was just leapfrogging everybody in the polls, including Lula, and everybody was saying he will get a massive coalition because everybody wants to tie themselves to a winning ticket. And now that the polls are not showing him in an advantageous position, we are seeing many right-wing parties recoiling. And we saw the União Brasil and Progressives Federation. This is the biggest party federation in Congress. They are saying that they will not pick a candidate in the presidential race and just let their state chapters support whoever they want, because they are seeing that in states where Lula polls very high, it is a political kryptonite to support whoever goes against Lula. But because the Progressives is chaired by Senator Ciro Nogueira, who a few months ago was thought as a possible running mate to Jair Bolsonaro, this is not an anodyne position or lack of position. We are also seeing the Republicans Party, a party tied to a massive evangelical church the Universal Church of the Kingdom of God, who are saying that their state chapters are frustrated with Flávio Bolsonaro and might not support him. So we are seeing a lot of the factions in the conservative camp.
And this is part of the way the electoral system works in Brazil, unlike the United States, which is basically a bipartisan two-party system. There are 28 more political parties in Congress. Some of them understand that at the end of the day, they might be able to negotiate some deals in order to be able to get a position in the new government, in a cabinet position, which allows them to appoint a lot of their supporters to political positions within that ministry. And so there's a large chunk of the middle which really goes the way the wind blows. They really are not at all ideologically aligned to one side or the other. And although they might not overtly support Lula, the fact that they're not supporting Flávio Bolsonaro is a possibility of opening doors for them in the future in terms of negotiations. I think that the other thing which is really interesting, and maybe we could talk a little bit about this, is the most recent issue, that is Jair Bolsonaro signed a statement saying he was supporting his son for the presidency, doing so creating a situation in which the Supreme Court, as part of the conditions of his being under house arrest, is he's not allowed to interfere in the electoral process or make statements. And having done that, written this little statement, very strangely the way it's done, and then passing it on to his son, who then posted it, is an indication that he actually might be punished for that. Now, I would say that that could go both ways. I think it could also create him as a victim if he's put back in prison because people are concerned about his health and allegedly has serious health problems. On the other hand, it also could put once more the far right on the defensive. What do you think about that?
Well, I think that the risk of him going back to prison is slim, because just last week he was granted an extended time in under house arrest. So I think, like you said, putting him back in jail just before the election, with the risk of him having a health crisis of any sort, that could be very problematic for Brazilian institutions. But I think that it's interesting that he has to risk going back to prison in order to reaffirm his son as his standard bearer. I think this is a demonstration of weakness, of how weak the Flávio Bolsonaro candidacy is. It's like dad had to write a letter for him to be a candidate in the first place, and now dad comes to the rescue. And I think for a political group that brands this macho way of doing politics, having to run and ask daddy for help really undercuts its own branding. And I think, like, whenever you have to reaffirm that you're the candidate, that's bad, right? Political leadership should be something that others identify in you, and not you try to show yourself as the leader all the time.
And what's going on in the Bolsonaro household? I really don't understand this. I've been trying to call friends in Brazil who allegedly have kind of insider news and can speculate about the relationship between Michele and Jair Bolsonaro. That's his third marriage. She had many other boyfriends and partners before they managed to get together, and he married her. She's staying in his house, I think, as far as I understand. And she did this broadcasting, it seems, from the house and criticizing, her husband's son, and including this new statement, which is very bizarre. What's going on there? I mean, is Jair? I think that's another element where people might thinking, excuse me, that Jair is even losing the control over his wife. And if you have an idea of a traditional wife and a traditional family, this is not good either, because she's seeming to be rebellious against her husband, which is not part of the package that the evangelical Christians and the far right are selling. So what is your take on this?
Well, Michele was supposed to be a token, right? She's the woman who represents that, we, the Bolsonaros, are good for women too. But because her role ahead of the Liberal Party's women section has become so high profile, Michele thought that she too has her own political light, and she wants she has a vision for where the movement needs to go. And I think, for instance, the fight between her and Flávio Bolsonaro, I think there are a few layers in it. One is, so Michelle is 27 years Jair's junior. And there has always been a big mistrust between his four political sons and her. And the idea within among the sons is, if dad is not around, someone in the family should be the standard bearer, implying that she's not part of the family. And but to Michelle's point, part of what ignited this public scolding that she did of her stepson was that she opposed an alliance in the state of Ceará with former presidential hopeful Ciro Gomes, who will now run for the governorship in Ceará. And I think she has a point. Ciro Gomes used to call Jair Bolsonaro a fascist and his son's proto-Nazi. And I mean, she's asking for coherence from the movement. So I don't think that, and also because she wants her allies to run in Ceará. So I think there's these two layers. There's the family element where there has never been love lost between the two sides, but that fight for the Jair Bolsonaro political state. Bolsonaro, he has no voice because, like you said, he is banned from making public statements, even by proxy. So both Flávio and Michelle present themselves as the mouthpiece for Bolsonaro, and I mean, there's no way to really know. I think that with the latter, Bolsonaro shows who side he's really on, which is his sons, and he has always resisted putting Michelle as a presidential candidate. He wants her to run for the Senate in order to build a bigger far-right bench, but not give her the top position within the movement. I think that's out of the realm of possibilities for the Bolsonaro man.
There's another thing that's going on in this process too, if we can step away from the fight between Flávio and Michelle, is the situation of Eduardo in the United States. Basically negotiating, and Flávio last week going to the United States to argue that we should suspend the Trump-imposed tariffs on Brazil just until the elections because it favors Lula. But then after that, we're willing to make any deal at all with the United States. And this really runs against a strong nationalist sentiment in Brazil. One feels that when one is in Brazil during the World Cup, the love of the country, the nationalism, and making a series of claims about what the United States intends to do with Bill. What are the goals of Trump? And he's declared clearly that Brazil is his next country in Latin America to conquer. That, what this means for losing support among people who might not support Lula and the left, but have a real strong sense of nationalism, including the fact that during the process of the impeachment of Dilma Rousseff, the far right appropriated the World Cup selections T-shirt, the colors of the Brazilian flag, and were the ones who wrapped themselves in national patriotism. And that also, I think, is going against their attempts to mobilize support beyond their core base.
Right, and it's interesting you say because I mean, on the 15th, the U.S. Trade Representative is going to conclude its investigation into alleged unfair trade practices by Brazil, and absolutely nobody in Brazil expect anything else rather than a 25% tariff on more or less 20% of Brazilian exports. Agro exports have largely been exempted from it because that hurts American families' pocketbooks directly when you talk about the orange juice, coffee, etc. But this will be a really major shot at some industries, such as those who produce industrial machines, footwear, wood products. This could be a death nail to many, many companies. And there are a few things happening here, and I think we could focus on the electoral side, but then I want to shift to a broader geopolitical point. But electorally speaking, I think it's unprecedented to see a political candidate so overtly asking for foreign intervention. And this is by no means the first time. Let's remember that in March, Flávio Bolsonaro was in Texas during a CPAC conference, which is sort of like this international mega event. And he said that if the US used its power to help him win the election, that the US could dispose of Brazil's rare earths, and that he would favor Brazil against China in any way he could. And this is unprecedented. I mean, one thing it's interesting is because even the military dictatorship, which staged the coup in 1964 with the backing of the US, they kept Washington at arm's length at all times. They welcomed the help from Washington, but they never fully trusted the US. They had this nationalistic sentiments, and it's something that I mean, I don't remember. And you, as a historian, I ask you to tell me: am I missing something? Was there another candidate that so overtly asked for help from Washington?
Carlos Lacerda allegedly, during the whole debates in the late 50s and 60s, was called an entreguista, a person who gave over the country, delivered the country in that way. It was a part of a big polemical fight about that. It had to do also during the debates about the nationalization of oil in the 1950s, the campaign.
And just if I may interrupt you, just for context, Carlos Lacerda was at the time the biggest political adversary of former President Getúlio Vargas, and who wanted to become president. And
right.
A big journalist at the time.
He was a journalist, had a very popular radio program. He also had a newspaper. So you're absolutely right. So that was another moment in which there was this close alignment between the right, the far right, and the United States. And as you pointed out, the United States did participate in overthrowing the 1964 government of João Goulart and supporting immediately with economic and military aid the new regime, the military regime. But the military, especially under the second president, Silva, and his successor, Médici, kept a distance from the United States. In fact, under the fourth of the five presidents, the Brazilian government decided not to strike a nuclear development deal with the United States, and instead signed an accord with Germany as a way of showing their distance. So a very close collaboration economically, but also a kind of a way of showing a certain performative distance from the United States. And so I think that's another big mistake that Flávio and his family is falling into, which is going to hurt him in the long run.
Yeah, well, I think what I see is a campaign just struggling to find an identity beyond being a Bolsonaro, and which is interesting because it's not as if Lula was running a perfect campaign. I think the left has many problems to connect with a big part of the electorate, but I think that what Lula is doing for the past few weeks is just standing still and applying that concept, like you never interrupt your adversary when they're making mistakes. So I think Lula is trying to be as low profile as possible and just let Flávio deliver him votes without saying much.
Right, and it's important for people who are not fully aware of the situation in Brazil to understand that the electoral campaign is actually a short period of time. Candidates are not considered candidates yet. They're called pre-candidates. They're able to do certain things in terms of campaigning, but are prohibited from doing other things. There's a lot of strict regulations about the use of funds and how the campaign.
You can't solicit votes at this point.
Right. It's a very, very regulated. It's prohibited for foreigners to participate in the elections in any way. They're not allowed to speak out in favor of one candidate over another. They're not allowed to give money to any of the electoral campaigns. Very strict rules. And so the campaign will be relatively short. It will kick off in August and will be August and September. The first round is in the early October. If there's a second round, it'll be the end of October. It's going to be a really crazy October because if we think about it, we have the second round of the Brazilian elections on the 25th, very, very important Israeli elections on the 27th, and then the U.S. midterm elections on November 3rd. So we're going to see a 10-day period where three very important countries, and especially related to the United States, are going to be possibly changing the government or reaffirming a government and seeing some seismic changes in the geopolitical world, all of which could blow up in the face of Donald Trump.
No, and one thing that is interesting, you mentioned the calendar, because in Brazil, by law, the first round is always in the first Sunday of October and the second round on the last Sunday of October. And in 2022, we had 5 weeks between the two rounds. And that the longer the campaign is, the better for the person trailing because it gives them more time to recover ground. And that's something that happened, that we saw Jair Bolsonaro, who was far behind Lula, gaining ground. And if the election happened 1 week later, he might have overcome Lula. And this time around, we only have 4 weeks. And a shorter period of time always helps the incumbent and the leader in the polls. So it is another factor that goes Lula's way.
Oh. So let's talk about tariffs.
I'm sorry?
Let's talk about tariffs in general, that report that you shared with me.
Yeah, exactly. Because so we are expecting 25% tariffs on Brazil because of allegedly unfair trade practices. We have another 12.5% coming because Brazil was listed in among several countries that, according to the US, does not do much to curb imports of goods made with forced labor. So we're talking about 37.5%, which is as close of an effective trade embargo as one can imagine without an actual embargo. I talked to officials from both the Brazilian and the US governments, and I think we see a pretty clear acknowledgement that the relationship is going to be and remain adversarial, which is adds to the shock of Flávio Bolsonaro's posture towards Washington. But regardless of how adversarial Washington has been to Brazil, that does not mean alignment to China. And I remember talking to a Chinese businessman 2 weeks ago, and he was dumbfounded, like, why do people who sell the most to China does not like China? And he was talking about Brazilian farmers. And now we have, a few weeks ago, the Getúlio Vargas Foundation, a think tank, published a report in which they did the first in-person survey with farmers in Brazil's grain frontier. And it shows that China is buying their soybeans, but is not buying their loyalties. They're still very much more aligned with the US. They trust the US more, even if they recognize China as equally influential in geopolitical terms, in economic terms, over Brazil.
No, it's a very interesting study that you shared with me. And it reminds me very much of a political development in the United States, where this area of Brazil, where there's a large amount of soy, sugar, sugarcane, ethanol, cattle raising, a very important part of the economy. It's the most important sector of the export economy. And the people there are very conservative. They tend to vote for Bolsonaro. They tend to vote for the right. A lot of evangelical Christians there as well who are also conservative. And yet they have this attitude, but they're willing to sell to China, just as during the Cold War, the Midwest relied on exports of wheat to the Soviet Union in order to sustain its production. And so there's a pragmatism there, I think. I think we look at that. It's a part of the country that remains conservative, politically conservative, but yet wants to survive and wants to gain wealth. And there's a tremendous amount of wealth in this part of the country. And so are willing to trade with anyone, Although, as you pointed out, their kind of ideological alliance, their cultural alliance is much more towards the United States. And
Yeah,
it's
just to give some, please.
no, it's interesting because there's a sector of the Brazilian left which looks to China as kind of a model for the future of the country in terms of guaranteeing social services and education, and therefore have created a kind of a imaginary fantasy about how China is a leading reference for possible Brazilian development, and that doesn't buy with these people who are, I'm sure, traveling to China and seeing China, but some of them, but still are much more interested in making sure that their soy beans get sold. And ironically, because of the Trump tariffs, the United States is blocking all the possibilities of this sector of the economy of selling to the U.S. market.
So just to give some numbers about this research, farmers were asked their level of trustworthiness towards China in the US. So 29% said they don't trust China at all, and 12.6% said they trust China very much. When we compare to the US numbers, less than 23% say they don't trust the US at all, and 22% say they trust very much. So 9 points more trust the US, and 6 points less say they don't trust the US. So an important gap there. And it's interesting because you mentioned the way the left looks at China. And I think, and please...
not the whole left, but sectors of the left. I think it's important to point that out.
Yes. But I think that's part of a way of looking the world still through Cold War goggles. Anything that is against US imperialism is by definition good or worth supporting. I think that's why even this Lula administration, which is by no means a super leftist administration, it hesitated a lot to call out the massacres that the Iranian government was conducting at the beginning of the year, whereas it was much quicker to acknowledge the brutality of what Israel was doing in Palestine. So I think you can see some of those double standards sometimes. I also think that these sectors of the left who look China with bright eyes, they tend to overlook the fact that China does not have Brazil's healthcare system the way Brazil has, that is universal, and mainly does not have Brazil's uber generous pension system. And that is the key feature when you're talking about like how to finance the state, etc. But I would say that I have been in Brasilia for the past month and talking to a few economic power brokers, a few people, and we are seeing that even in the right, people are becoming more welcoming to a Chinese model that is much less democratic, because many business leaders, they see what is happening in the Brazilian Congress, and I heard this verbatim from someone saying that the way that Brazilian democracy is operating is killing the republic, which is because what they're saying.
No.
Because what they're saying is Congress is becoming more and more corrupt, and everything has to have an under the bed deal, and money has to change hands, and it's becoming overwhelmingly difficult to do anything if you're not willing to go into the mud. And also we are seeing a rapprochement of the political class and organized crime. We are seeing several federal police investigations showing that many corrupt politicians and these organizations that have been declared terrorist organizations by the US government using the same financial plumbing for money laundering. And we have seen just the past few days in Rio, a police operation that is actually changing the way we look at politics in Rio, it is increasingly difficult to say that crime is infiltrating politics because these two things look increasingly the same. So
Right.
at one point you cannot even say that it's infiltrating. It's the line is blurred to the point of non-existence.
Yeah, and which brings me up to another point, which I think is very interesting, is that the United States is now calling for an international conference and an international organization to fight the far left in Latin America, and it's called on Brazil to join that. I'm not sure that the Ministry of Foreign Relations will join this effort because it really is it's a Trojan, it's a fake, it's a silly argument that the biggest danger in the United States, as Donald Trump is saying, is anti-communism, the democratic socialists of America somehow are equivalent to the worst notions of what the Soviet Union were, and they're trying to bring this ideology to Latin America, keeping in mind that Mexico and Brazil are the only two center-left governments, with the exception of, I guess, Uruguay, in South America or in Latin America, excluding the Caribbean, and it's a very clear policy of the Trump administration to use these languages in order to try to impose their influence and, in a way, use this as a way to support Flávio Bolsonaro and the U.S. elections. And finally, I wanted just to point out that, during the dictatorship, the far right, the right that supported the government, had no problem of suspending democracy at any time in order to get its goals met. And so there is a tradition among certain sectors of the far right since 1945 of supporting some kind of controlled democracy. But the minute that it looks like they're not going to be able to carry out their goals, they can suspend it at will. And so I can see this sentiment that you're describing in Congress of people saying, well, this democracy is not working. Let's come up with a system which is less democratic or more authoritarian, which will just get things done. We'll eliminate crime and eliminate other problems. And this is a big challenge that any democratic society has. How do we do things like fight against organized crime or fight against common petty crime in the streets without becoming authoritarian, without killing innocent people, without carrying out measures which really take away individual rights in the country? And I think the Workers' Party and the left have not yet found a solution to this question.
No, and to be fair, this increasing frustration with democracy is not just people looking at China, but I mean it comes from the U.S. too, because we see Peter Thiel and these other Silicon Valley billionaires preaching against democracy. Curtis Yarvin has become an influential person with the Brazilian far right. We have a few small parties trying to become the next leaders within the right wing that drink from that well. So yeah, I mean, we are seeing this skepticism towards democracy coming from all sides, and because Brazilian democracy is failing to deliver, it is resonating with a lot of people from different ideological backgrounds and different social standings, and it's something to be really scared about.
And if even if Flávio Bolsonaro loses, does not mean that the far right has been defeated. They're still there. They're very strong. They're going to be rearticulated. The Bolsonaro family wants to make control of this movement, but it's possible it might escape from them in the future as there's some kind of reorganization. Just as if Lula wins the elections in 4 years, the Workers' Party has to solve a serious succession problem, because there have to be new leaders that can build the kind of same relationship with the population in order to sustain themselves in power. And that's going to be a big challenge for the Workers' Party, independently of what the results of the October elections are.
Great. And James, for our next meeting, I would like for us to talk a little bit about, because you mentioned briefly the different candidates trying to take Flávio Bolsonaro's position as the big Lula challenger. I think we could spend some time next time talking about who are the three main wannabe challengers Ronaldo Caiado, Romeu Zema, and Renan Santos. And I think that each one brings very different things to the table, and it's worth delving into their profiles and how we see them from 2026 onwards.
I think that's great. I think in 26, it's like, what third way, which was the big question that I had at in 22. There isn't one or wasn't one. But nevertheless, these are new. These are figures that are hoping to survive 26 and be in place for 30. And so I think they're very important for us to understand them, their politics, their goals, their alignments. And so it'll be a wonderful conversation we'll have. And we'll inform our public, which it's very hard to figure out Brazilian politics. It's very complicated. I have a lot of difficulty understanding it myself. And so this will be a wonderful opportunity to kind of broaden out between this notion of polarization between the Bolsonaro camp and the Lula Workers' Party camp to other players in this game. And especially because these players are not going to go away in the Congress, as the Congress will likely be very much a conservative Congress that might even try to launch an impeachment attempt against Lula should he win the elections.
James, thank you very much. Always a stimulating conversation, and see you next time.
Take care. See you next time.